It's been a minute since I've shot one of these. I intended to do it a few months ago, but 2024 did not turn out to be the best year for me. Chief amongst these was the loss of my best friend, Dan. Dan was a bit of a Doctor Who fan like myself, though he was a much more massive Star Wars fan. Dan was the kind of fan who would keep the positivity alive. He wasn't someone who gave in to cynicism a lot in his fandom. I think the best description of Dan I heard came from his brother, who said that Dan could be childlike, but not childish. That he would keep the wonder of a child alive while still thinking as an adult. And I think that's a very apt description of Dan, and I miss him. Normally, what I do when I'm feeling sad would be to have pet my dog Diana. Unfortunately, I also lost her this year. 14 years old, and an absolute bundle of love and affection, even if we spoiled her a lot. Also, just generally, the events of my country and the more recent election have done a lot to engender a sort of feeling of a loss of freedom and of hope in the world. At least that's the effect they've had on me. I recognize that I don't speak for everyone. But I remember that Doctor Who got canceled once. It was off the air for 16 years, bar, the occasional little blip. And if Doctor Who can come back, then so can hope and freedom. I'm aware of how silly and cheesy that sounds, but one of the things I learned from watching Doctor Who is that sometimes really wonderful things come packaged in silliness and cheese. So that doesn't particularly bother me. So, onward now to the 5th episode of Doctor Who's second serial, The Expedition. At the end of the previous episode, The Ambush, our heroes realized that they could not leave in the TARDIS because they had left the fluid link, an essential part of the TARDIS, back in the Dalek city. It had been taken from them when they were captured. So now, they have to find a way to go back and get it. And that leaves us to this episode, The Expedition. During this episode, the travelers, particularly Ian, convinced the Thals to help them break into the city to retrieve their lost equipment, and also to protect themselves. There's a great deal of debate over why the Thals should be helping them. And they begin the process of trying to break back into the city. On the Dalek side of things, the Daleks realize that the Thal radiation drug is actually lethal to them, and they need radiation to survive and will act accordingly. In terms of general impressions, this episode is a bit of a transitional episode. At least that's the way it seems to me. We're transitioning between the initial escape from the Dalek city in the previous episode to now the actual struggle against the Daleks to break in and stop their plans. But just because it's a transitional episode doesn't mean there isn't interesting stuff in it. In particular, there's a theme running through the episode, which is the practical versus the ethical, which I think is really interesting and worth examining. In effect, this episode is the final nail in the coffin of the debate over pacifism that's been going on for the past few episodes, as the Thals are convinced to fight for their own sake. So pacifism is effectively thrown out the window. Now, as I mentioned in the last episode, the Thals' pacifism in the story is generally treated more like a plot obstacle for the travelers to overcome than it is a legitimate ethical stance. To an extent, even Ian's objections to trying to get the Thals to fight are treated also like a plot obstacle, like that's something he needs to get around in order to do what he needs to do. Now, I am not a pacifist. A bit like Ian, I believe that true pacifism, being unwilling to fight under any circumstances, only works, as Ian says, when everyone agrees. And that a world in which true pacifists have to live with non-pacifists just leaves us with a world where the strong constantly dominate the weak. Now, that having been said, I'm not a big fan of war either. I don't believe there's any righteousness in forcing your will upon someone else. So really, I end up in basically the same ethical position as Ian in this story. I believe fighting is sometimes a necessary evil in order to make your way in the world, but the key word there is evil. Sometimes it has to be done. That doesn't make it a good thing. Looking at the regulars, let's view them through that lens of practicality versus ethics that I was talking about earlier. The Doctor falls firmly on the practical side of this debate. He even has a line, "This is no time for morals," which pretty much sums up his feelings on the matter. The Doctor sees the Thals as the answer to their problem about getting the fluid link back, and he has no ethical qualms about using them in that fashion. Indeed, the Doctor seems to simply assume the Thals will be willing to help them. That's an interesting perspective because it raises the question, does he assume they will see that as the practical solution themselves? Or does the Doctor just believe anyone practical will agree with him? Because ego is definitely a factor in the Doctor's belief system. I mean, it always will be, but especially at this point. Note how he says he prizes Susan's faith in him. That's important. It's important to the Doctor that other people regard him as smart. Now, on the other side of things, there's Ian, who is falling on the ethical side of this debate. Ian is unwilling to sacrifice the Thals simply to save himself and his friends. I think he just views that as mercenary. But Ian also does want to save his friends, which is also an ethical position. Plus, Ian does genuinely believe that the Thals' position of pacifism will get them killed. So it's interesting to note that Ian's internal debate is not between ethics and practicality, but between two different ethical positions. Wider ethical concerns that concern everyone, and the ethics of loyalty to one's friends. Now, Ian settles this by landing on the notion that Ian can live with recruiting the Thals to fight if he gets them to fight on their own terms and for their own reasons rather than simply to help them. Now that's a fine line, but it's clearly an important one to Ian. He's not just saying words to justify it to himself. This is clearly important to him. It's also worth noting that Ian, presuming Ian is the same age as William Russell, who plays him, is old enough to have probably fought in World War II, which means that Ian is very familiar with the concept of a just but awful war. A war that needs to be fought, but that doesn't make it any more pleasant than any other war. Now, it's interesting to look at how Ian goes about recruiting the Thals, what his methodology is. Basically, he uses an escalating level of threat. Ian demonstrates all the things that the Daleks are going to take from the Thals. He starts with something less tangible, their self-respect. But after that, he moves on to objects. He particularly chooses their history records because he knows that's something important to them. And finally, Ian escalates to taking people away when he grabs Dione and threatens to take her down to the city. So Ian is interestingly using a very practical method, even though his reasoning is almost purely ethical. So what about the two girls? Barbara falls mostly on the practical side of things in this episode. Barbara wants to leave, and she guilt trips Ian for getting in the way of that. Although it's worth noting that Ian in turn guilt trips her and the Doctor for being selfish in this regard. And they do look uncomfortable at the accusation. Barbara, in fact, might be wholly convinced because she does later say he's right, referring to Ian. So Barbara's not entirely cold about this. So here we have Barbara's desire for safety conflicting with her moral compass. So unlike Ian, who's trapped between two ethical positions, Barbara is arguably having an actual more of a practical versus ethical debate in her head. What's good for her versus what's good for everyone. Separate from Barbara's place in the ethical debate, there is Barbara the adventurer later, when they begin their expedition toward the city. This makes a definite change from Barbara's unwilling adventurer from the first episode of this serial, The Dead Planet. Is it simply that Barbara's getting more used to the situation, or are there other factors involved? She's clearly attracted to Ganatus, one of the Thals, and we'll talk about that a bit later, and that may well play a factor. But whatever the reason, Barbara is definitely portrayed in this sequence as brave but unskilled. And I don't mean that as a slight. Barbara persevering despite her fear is a testament to her bravery. In fact, it is contrasted with the role of Antidus, one of the Thals, who seems to be much more at the mercy of his fears. The last of our travelers is Susan, and she falls mostly on the ethical side of the debate. She wants to back Ian up. Although I will say that in Susan's case, it seems to be more of an emotional reaction rather than a thought-out ethical position. Does she truly believe what Ian is saying, or does she just back up Ian because she likes Ian? Does she want to help the Thals because she thinks it's right to help the Thals, or just because she likes the Thals? Or a bit of both? There's evidence in lots of directions in this. She clearly finds the Thals physically attractive, Aladon in particular, but all of the Thals are made out to be physical perfection, albeit Aryan physical perfection. But Susan also seems to genuinely like them as people, too. And we established back in the first episode of this serial that she has a bit of a crush on Ian as well, so all of these things could be factors as to why she's acting as she is. And that brings us rather neatly to the Thals. And we will start with their leader, Aladon. Over the course of the episode, Aladon goes from completely dismissing Ian's ideas to wavering on them to eventually becoming convinced of them, even acting despite himself when Ian threatens to take Dione down to the city. I think it's a nice touch that Aladon is clearly aware that he's being baited by Ian, but he can't help himself anyway. It speaks to Aladon's real feelings as opposed to what he's been taught to believe by his previous leaders like Temesis. It's also a nice touch that he speaks to Dione about this and she backs him up. I think it also allows Dione to be, at least for a moment, a little bit more than sort of the token female Thal and Aladon's love interest. Gives her a little bit more character. Not a whole lot, but every little bit helps. It's worth noting that Aladon's decision is not immediate. He takes the time to think about it. It's given appropriate weight and time. And when Aladon decides, he explains himself to his people. He explains that the Daleks are an existential threat to the Thal's existence, which indeed they are. It's also not a selfish decision. He lays out his case, but he also offers to step down and let someone else lead if he's not convincing to everyone. So he could still follow his conscience without dragging everyone else along with him. It's very, ethical. Speaking of those people of his, there's Ganatus, who is probably moving into more of the lead Thal role in this episode. Let's get this right out of the way. Ganatus clearly has a thing for Barbara, and it's mutual. I mean, he sleeps on her thigh later in the episode. Now, maybe that's a common practice amongst Thals, but it isn't for Barbara, and she doesn't object. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not complaining about this at all. Good for Barbara. She deserves a love interest, just like anybody. But, back to the more practical concerns, Ganatus is clearly ready to back up Aladon's decision. In fact, given that he created this map to get into the city, it seems pretty clear to me that he was already willing to go. He was just waiting on Aladon's say-so. Now, Ganatus' other big relationship is with his brother Antidus. Ganatus and Antidus are symbolic in this story of bravery and fear. Ganatus is clearly scared, but willing to move forward, whereas Antidus is more at the mercy of his fears. Indeed, Antidus' fears are presented more like outright cowardice. In the previous episode, we saw that Ganatus finds Antidus' level of fear embarrassing. He's embarrassed for his brother, and that it reflects upon him. There's really no two ways about it. The episode presents fear as bad, and it's not particularly subtle about it. That said, here we get into that practicality again. Even Ganatus is not willing to travel across the lake itself. He's brave, but he's not suicidal. And that's good, because the bad guys in this episode are the Daleks. The Daleks, we get a Dalek POV point of view in this one, seeing things through the Dalek lens. And it's interesting because it's very claustrophobic and kind of representative of how the Daleks see the world. It's tunnel vision. They see through their own tiny little narrow window, and there's no real perspective other than their own straight-on view. We also see Dalek efficiency. They've used their technology to capture photos of the Thals and the travelers. We see them very methodically test to see if the radiation heals the effects of the anti-radiation drugs they've been trying out. Daleks are presented as evil, but also as very competent, which of course makes them even more dangerous. That said, their general lack of empathy leads to misunderstandings. They have a line in the episode, "It is logical that they will attack us," talking about the Thal. And while that's sort of true now, because the Daleks have already attacked them, it's worth noting that this seems like it would have been the Dalek attitude regardless. They don't seem to grasp the concept of a sentient life form that might not be hostile to them. For all their intelligence, they also can't seem to understand the Thals' tactics. They see that the Thals are splitting into two groups, but they can't figure out why. And of course, plot-wise, we learn that the Daleks have recognized that they need radiation to live. The anti-radiation drug is actually lethal to them, and that they're going to have to fix the problem of the planet's lowering radiation level, possibly by releasing another neutron bomb. This, of course, creates stakes for the rest of the episode. The Daleks will act against the Thals, which means the Thals must, plot-wise, act to stop them. And of course, our heroes have to help the Thals. In terms of the show's wider continuity, there's an interesting link to the future that I've always thought about this episode. The Lake of Mutations, which is where Ian and Barbara and Ganatus's group is planning on traveling by. I've always assumed that the Lake of Mutations is in the location where the cave in Genesis of the Daleks was, where Davros's discarded experiments were. Mutation experiments. And so I assume that they were left there, and as the saying goes, they were fruitful and multiplied. So now we've gone from a little cave with some of Davros's experiments to a whole lake over time absolutely filled with these mutated species. Some little things about the episode I like. I still think the Dalek City looks cool. I really do. It looks neat to me. That retro 50s aesthetic really works, even though it wasn't that retro at the time. This was only 63. Well, 64 by the time it came out, but it was shot in 63. As I mentioned, the Doctor says that he prizes Susan's faith in him, and I like that. It's a little egotistical, but it's a nice touch that the Doctor finds his granddaughter's opinion important. It's actually sort of sweet. It's also arguably one of the first examples in the show of the companion's attitudes affecting the Doctor's, particularly with the potential to make him a better person. It's important to him that Susan continues to look up to him as a good person. We also get the first real blatant joke about the Doctor not being able to remember Ian's last name. Some people attribute this to William Hartnell fluffing the line, but if you look at the exchange, it's clearly a scripted exchange, including Ian's responses to it. I have no doubt that some of the later instances of this are Hartnell messing up lines, but this particular first one does seem to be scripted. And of course, that's going to be a running joke that the Doctor can't remember Ian's last name. I like in a kind of a melodramatic way that when the Daleks talk about exploding another neutron bomb, there's this big clash of music. It's played for like maximum melodrama and portentousness, and that kind of amuses me. We also get some cardboard Daleks. In the Dalek City, in the Dalek control room, there's a bunch of Daleks in the background who are clearly cardboard cutouts. This is obviously done to make it look as if there are more Daleks than there are. And it's worth noting that with the resolution on televisions in 1964, there's a pretty good chance this would have worked, and that those wouldn't have been noticeable, but they're noticeable now, and it's kind of amusing. For effects that do work, the approach to the swamp as they're going to the Lake of Mutations, it's creepy, both in a visual and a sound sort of way. I love all the churning and bubbling. There's clearly dry ice there, and there's all this popping sound going on. The place is clearly filled with living things, and some of them are obviously dangerous. There's a little bit where Ian has to stop and just sort of whack something. You don't even get to see what it is. It's interesting, and it's very well done. As an example, I like the creature that rises up out of the water in the swamp and scares the heck out of Ian. Clearly just an air bladder effect being used. It's very simple, but it's very effective. And I actually think that it works particularly well in black and white. There's also an interesting exchange as they're walking through the swamp, where Ganatus says that he's surprised that Ian allowed Barbara to come. And Ian's response is, "I'd be more surprised if I could have stopped her." I like this because I like Ian showing respect for Barbara's level of willpower. It feels like him learning his lesson from having tried to argue with her about saving Za back in the previous serial. Ganatus also mentions that the Thals are more used to living this traveling nomadic life than Ian and Barbara are. And the episode is consistent with that. The Thals have a much easier time traveling than Ian and Barbara throughout the episode. Now, that's not meant as a slight on Ian and Barbara. Their willingness to go through with this, even though it's harder for them than everyone else, is a testament to their willpower and their bravery. They're willing to move out of their element in order to get the job done. Another little bit I like that I think is interesting is the Thals have a little mechanical device for heat and light. It's a little thing about yay big, kind of looks like what we'd call a space heater, but they simply refer to it as fire, as if it was a campfire, even though they can pick it up and move it around and turn it on and off. And I think it's interesting because it speaks to this being an alien world with its own customs and technology and terminology. And I really like that. And then we get to the end of the episode, and there's a sort of a whirlpool effect as one of the Thals, Elion, is attacked by the water near the lake. The Thal expedition through the swamp consists of Ian, Barbara, Ganatus, Antidus, Elion, and Christus. We're going to be following for the next couple of episodes as they try to traverse their way into the Dalek city. And Elion is the first to go. He's attacked by something under the water. Like I said, we get a little whirlpool effect, which I don't think is the most amazing effect in the world, but it does sort of get across what's supposed to be happening. And that leads us right into the cliffhanger, which is Elion's scream and everyone at the camp running to find out what happened to him. It's not the most amazing cliffhanger, but it does focus on that fear. I believe it ends on Barbara's face as she hears, and it just sort of emphasizes how much danger everyone is in. And that's how the expedition ends. Feel free to comment below, like, share, subscribe, all that good algorithm YouTube stuff. And next time we'll find out what happens next.